Daniel, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine, James Wesley Rawles. Can you hear me?
Yes, just fine. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, welcome to the Edge Television broadcast, James.
Thank you so much.
Well, I saw somebody in our live chat watching the program. They said, "Hey, we're going to have doomgasm tonight," but James, I don't think that we're going to go total doomgasm. But if we have one, then we certainly want to give people a remedy to get out of that doomgasm.
Well, I hope that we can at least inform and motivate your listeners and viewers to get prepared, get their families prepared. We really are at a juncture in our nation's history where it's high time for individuals to team up, to stock up, and to train up.
And I noticed even in the bio section that we put up with you, it says there are those that you believe have sort of distorted the true message of survivalism, and maybe you might even label them sort of fringe proponents. But you said instead you focus on family preparedness and personal freedom. So you see personal freedom as a matter of survival?
Absolutely. The two are inextricably linked, Daniel. We will not have a free society unless we have a functioning society. And the converse, of course, works as well. I'm a big believer in restoration of constitutional government. I think it can happen in our lifetimes. I have my doubts, however, that with the current political milieu, since we essentially have two socialist parties running the country, the Democrat Party, which is a truly heavily socialist party, and the Republican Party, which is a socialist party that's not in quite as much of a hurry. But they both have the same goal, and we really need to combat that. And I think that part of survivalism is a important part of that is a political component, because we really need to see restoration of constitutional government in this country.
So what you're saying then basically is the Republicans is sort of a kinder, gentler socialist.
Yes, they are. We have Socialist Party A and Socialist Party B, and their goals are the same. One's just in more of a hurry than the other. I think it was, was it George McGovern? No. Who was it? Someone back in the 1960s. Oh, it was George Wallace. He famously said that there's not a nickel's worth of difference between the Republican and the Democrat Party. And even though he was a bigot, and I can't stomach that, I think he did have that part right. I think he was absolutely right that you really can't tell too much difference between the Republican and the Democrat parties. And I think in the long term we may see the emergence of a third party in this country, but we may see a lot of hard times between now and then, because those two parties that have been running Congress have been running America into huge, almost inescapable debt. Right now, the national debt is so large that if interest rates were to rise just 2 or 3%, the U.S. government would be unable to service the federal debt without resorting to mass inflation.
Well, let me ask something on that issue. Back in the day, Ross Perot said that if a fighter pilot would see our deficit on his radar screen, he would eject. Now, back in those days when he was running, the deficit was in the billions. Now here we are in the trillions, and I can still go to Walmart and get me a damn loaf of bread for $1. So when is that monetary system going to break down, or will it ever?
Oh, I think we will see it. It's inevitable in our lifetimes, probably in the next 10 years, simply because foreign confidence in the U.S. dollar as a currency unit is going to slowly erode. The Chinese, with the emergence of the yuan currency, and OPEC with movement toward settling OPEC oil sales contracts in currencies other than the dollar, have basically put the handwriting on the wall. In the long term, the dollar as a currency unit is doomed. And once international confidence in the dollar diminishes, they're not going to want to turn over their their long bond contracts for U.S. Treasuries. And once that happens, all bets are off, because in order to keep turning over that Treasury paper, the U.S. government's going to have to offer higher and higher interest rates to attract foreign buyers of that paper.
Mm-hmm. But isn't
that's where inflation is just going to totally get away from them?
Well, it seems like it's just sort of continuing on. They were saying that the European Union would collapse if Britain got out, or if they voted for Brexit, which they did, and it didn't collapse. It's still there, still continuing. I don't think any of those countries don't want to do business with the UK. So there's dire predictions in the financial end, but they seem to just keep on going.
Yeah, well, I think there'll be a continuing soft collapse of the European Union. And the euro as a currency unit may not exist in another 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. But I do, to get back to the political process, I do hold out some hope that we'll have restoration of constitutional government here in the United States. And I think that Brexit was a good thing. I think that the recently failed but probably soon to be reignited calls for the exit of Scotland from the UK mm-hmm. is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And in the long term, the same sort of political upswelling that you saw in the United States with the election of President Trump, I think will eventually sweep the globe. Mm-hmm.
But
it's populism, plain and simple.
But it did get shifted into reverse in France, did it not?
Yes, it did. But the problem was Marine Le Pen was just a little too extreme for the average French voter. And in France, you have entrenched socialism. Ever since the days of de Gaulle, France has slid down that slippery slope of socialism. Mm-hmm. The average French worker works a 4-day work week. They have some of the most liberal policies on the planet in terms of employee health care, spousal benefits, maternity leave, you name it. It's a socialist people's paradise. Yeah. And they've become so accustomed to that in France that it was a stretch for them to consider bringing in someone like Marine Le Pen, mm-hmm. who would have basically been another Margaret Thatcher, mm-hmm. where she would have rolled back the tide of socialism. And the people of France just weren't ready for that, unfortunately.
Well, right, and it also doesn't help that a lot of the men over there run around saying "we." I mean, if that's going on, they're going to have some problems. Hey, by the way, one of our viewers in the UK asked the question if you know anything about their political process. Are you familiar with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leader? He's a Labour leader.
Yes, I'm familiar with the Labour Party. I was talking earlier about Socialist Party A and B here in the United States. Well, in England, they've got 3 of them, and they're all socialist. Mm-hmm. No, seriously, the Conservative Party in England is trying to make inroads, but there you've got the same problem. You have entrenched socialism. A lot of it dates back to basically when Winston Churchill stepped down shortly after World War II. Mm-hmm. And they've had socialism there ever since. Even Margaret Thatcher wasn't able to put a serious dent in the socialist tide. And seeing Brexit pass was very encouraging, but they still have a long way to go.
Mm. All right, we have another question for you, James. And by the way, you run survivalblog.com.
Right, yeah. It's a family preparedness blog. It's been posted daily for the last 12 years. It's kind of the granddaddy of family preparedness sites out there. And whether you call us preppers or survivalists really doesn't matter. We're all the same folks.
Well, just to be clear,
the blog is kind of like a standard reference. There's huge archives there. They're all available free of charge. And I highly encourage your listeners and viewers to check it out. Again, it's survivalblog.com. all of the content there is fully searchable. You can print out or save to a memory disk whatever files you want. Please take full advantage of it, folks. It's all free of charge. So please dig into that material and get smart on the topics you need to prepare your families and get prepared.
I think anybody that is a supporter or apologist for socialism should just ask how it's working in Venezuela. Because I believe that the people are now digging in the garbage of restaurants and rampaging through the streets. So I'm not sure that, that always seems to be the end of socialism, that type of thing. People find that, hey, they don't have to work so hard because they can just take the fruits of the labor of other people until there's nobody left to pick the pockets of. And then it's anarchy. So it works well for a while somebody's cashing in, and then you have to pay the piper. All right. So here's back to the question. What do you think will trigger a worldwide? Now, they've said the word, and that's a euphemism on a word we use here on the edge, doomgasm, but a worldwide collapse. What would be a couple triggers that you could see?
Well, there's several. First and foremost would be a debt implosion, because there's a massive amount of debt that's been built up, both public and private. The public sector debt, of course, is primarily the federal debt, although more than 30 states in the United States are running deficits as well and have their own little mountains of debt. And then on the private side, we have home mortgages, we have car loans, we have student debts, which have grown to just enormous proportions. Between the credit card debt, the student loan debt, the home loans, the car loans, it's just a mountain of debt. And we're at the point now where, unless there's mass inflation in this country, it will be mathematically impossible for our federal government to ever repay that debt. Mm-hmm. And in my novel Patriots, the first novel in my Patriots series, mm-hmm. I put forth a scenario where the national debt gets to the point where foreign creditors no longer want to roll over their U.S. treasuries. Inflation ratchets up, and then it kicks over into hyperinflation, just like what we're seeing today in Venezuela. In Venezuela, the inflation rate is over 300% per year, and I predict that unless there's a change of government in Venezuela, that within a few years, it's going to go full Zimbabwe, and we're going to see 10,000, 20,000% inflation annually, mm-hmm. and where the Venezuelan currency unit is essentially just wiped out. Mm-hmm. And then they have a full reset. They just have to start from scratch. Mm-hmm. In Zimbabwe, it got so bad they were printing $1 million bills, then $1 trillion bills. They got all the way up to $100 trillion bills before they finally gave up. And the reason they gave up was because the cost of printing $100 trillion bill was nearly worth what that bill cost. So they had to give up printing their own currency. They completely destroyed the purchasing power of their own currency unit. And now in Zimbabwe, they use either the South African rand or U.S. dollars. And if any of your listeners have ever visited Zimbabwe, the U.S. dollars you see in circulation there look absolutely shabby, because those same bills keep getting passed around from person to person, mm-hmm. and they're literally falling apart.
Which, by the way, I have your book in my background, Patriots, a Novel of Survival for the Coming Collapse. And here's a question from our live chat. Cleet wants to know, what are the chances that the U.S. will degrade to something similar or worse than what's already happening in Venezuela?
Well, it's possible. As I often say in radio interviews and talking with my consulting clients, the real linchpin is whether or not the U.S. power grids stay up. There's actually 3 grids in the United States: an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. Mm-hmm. If those grids go down, all bets are off. Mm-hmm. And there's any number of different situations that could cause those grids to go down. One would be an economic collapse and then rioting to the point where people who run the power plants just don't feel safe getting to work. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the nuclear power plants, once they're below a certain level of staffing, by law, by the NRC regulations, the nuclear power plants have to be scrammed. They have to be shut down because if they don't have a staffing level that's considered safe, they can't operate. They have to shut down those plants. Well, so that would, just by itself, would drop the eastern grid. Well, out west, there's very, very little nuclear power, but right now the power industry is right in the middle of turning the three North American grids into one big grid. They're creating what's called the grid intertie. Mm-hmm. So there will no longer be an isolated Western grid or an isolated Texas grid. If one grid goes down, they all go down.
A couple of weeks ago, I think 3 different cities, maybe more, all went down. Were they on those 3 separate grids?
They were on 2 different grids, yes. And the problem we could face is if enough plants go offline, whether they're hydroelectric plants or coal-fired plants or natural gas plants or nuclear power plants, if enough go offline, it's difficult to reconstitute the grid, to get the grid back up. And once the grid goes down, what people don't realize is that to restart those plants, they don't have the power in-house to restart those plants. Let's say it's a coal-fired plant or a natural gas-fired plant. Mm-hmm. They need grid power to restart their plant. So once the grid is down, and if it's down for more than 24, 48 hours, the longer it stays down, the chances of bringing the grid back up start to diminish.
Well, James, as the socialist utopia in Venezuela continues to degrade, shouldn't we expect millions of their residents to make their way north to the United States?
Well, yeah, they'll just kind of be added to the current flood, I think the other countries that are their contiguous neighbors will probably be, of course, the more immediate recipients. But yes, there is the possibility that a refugee outflow from Venezuela could make its way all the way to the United States. Mm-hmm. There'd be a time delay, of course, but it would be substantial.
Do you think one EMP pulse would knock all 3 grids out at the same time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One EMP or one X-class solar flare. If we had something of the order of the Carrington event of the 1850s, we could definitely see all 3 grids go down. And again, if the grids go down, all bets are off because we have a very fragile society that's highly dependent upon grid power and telecommunications. Mm-hmm. If the grid goes down, there's millions of people in this country who are chronically ill, who are dependent upon medical oxygen, who are dependent upon insulin, on CPAP breathing machines, on kidney dialysis, on heart-lung machines, the whole works. We could see a die-off in this country as great as 10% within the first 8 weeks of a grid-down collapse. And if it continues and spans one full winter, we could see a die-off as great as 60%. And most of those people would be in the big cities on the 2 coasts.
What's the differentiation between a X-class solar flare and a standard solar flare?
Well, in the X-class range, it's basically an order of magnitude larger. So you end up with a waveform that looks a lot like EMP. There's a very fast rise time, and it hits the Earth's atmosphere and propagates through the atmosphere. And basically any lengthy linear object acts as an antenna for either EMP or for a solar flare. And it couples that energy into any electrical or electronic device that's connected to it. So whether that is a telephone line or a power line, or even a long fence line for that matter, it all acts as an antenna for EMP. So if and when an EMP hits or a solar flare hits, any device that you have plugged into grid power mm-hmm. or that's connected to a fairly large antenna is probably going to get fried. Your electronics that are not connected, which would mean any of your car electronics or any radio or laptop or other electronic device that's not currently plugged in or has an antenna connected will probably be just fine. Any that are connected are probably going to be toast.
James, how much time does it take for the effects of an X-class solar flare, once it happens, to hit the Earth?
Well, it's a 3 or 4 day lull, but once it hits, then the effects are immediate. And so you may read that there was a massive solar flare, and you could have a couple of days warning before it actually, because there's a solar observatory that's called SOHO, that is constantly, it's a satellite that's constantly monitoring the face of the sun and looking for solar flares. So there's a warning, a visible warning before the solar flare itself would impact the ionosphere and then propagate down through the Earth's atmosphere.
Is that the only negative effects? It would be the electronics. Is there any human effects, animal or plant effects?
Probably nothing that would affect animals or plants directly, unless it's a massive, mega X class, and that could be an extinction level event. But the chances are we'd have something more like the Carrington event of the 1850s. But even in those days, that was enough to send. It actually set telegraph equipment on fire, just because they were hooked up to telegraph lines, and those were purely electrical, not electronic devices. If we were to have something like that hit in our modern age, where we have microcircuits with very small gates, we could have huge effects. And not only would it fry individual small microcircuits, it would also fry the transformers at all the substations and power generating stations all up and down the line. And a lot of those transformers at those different sites are custom built. They're huge. I mean, they're a lot of them require, the massive lowboy trucks to transport. They're called mega loads, just to transport these things. And there's very few spares out there. Because they cost millions of dollars, some of these transformers. Some of them are ordered years in advance from places like Switzerland. It's a very long lead time to get these things. So if we had a massive EMP event or a massive solar flare event, it could take down the power grids, and it could literally take years, assuming we still had a normal functioning infrastructure, just to replace those transformers. I don't think we're even going to have that opportunity, because I think once the lights go out, civilization as we know it will collapse.
James, I've had various survivalists, so to speak, on the show, and I know there's a kind of three different scenarios that I see as far as survivability. There are those that believe that you should establish a safe house, so to speak, out in a forest, fully stocked. It seems to be an individualist method. There are those, and I think Dave Hodges might be among them, where he lives in a general area, in a wide open space, sort of out west, where there's wide open spaces, but and maybe in contact with his neighbors, but his neighbors may be some distance between them. And then there's those that believe in it, sort of a community, a close-knit community. Now, which one of those has the highest survivability rate?
I would think probably if it's a grid down collapse, it would have to be a community with a population of less than 3,000 people. Because once you get over 3,000 people, if you have a grid down collapse, you have too many health concerns, public health concerns, because people's toilets won't be flushing, and people don't have the common sense to dig outhouses. And also, once you get more than about 3,000 people, you don't have a real sense of community. It's kind of every man for himself. If you have less than 3,000 people, you have the chances of that community basically barricading itself, trying to set up, local barter networks, and hunkering down together as a community. I think the community approach is probably the best, although in my own personal circumstances, I live in a very remote area. We do have some neighbors that are in kind of far shouting distance, but I live out in the middle of national forest. It's a 25-mile drive to to the nearest small town where I can buy gas. It's a 30-mile drive to the nearest town where I have decent grocery shopping. It's a 75 or 80-mile drive to the nearest Walmart.
Wow.
In fact, it's a 15-mile drive just to the nearest cell phone signal from where I am. So I'm in a very remotely populated region in the inland Northwest. And I like the Northwest because there's so much hydroelectric power here. And if the national power grids go down, we have the opportunity here, because we're a power exporting region, to reconstitute a local grid almost immediately. In fact, our local power co-op has plans that if the Western grid goes down, they would reconstitute and keep their generators spinning and producing power locally just in a matter of a few seconds or a minute after the national grid goes down. They've actually pre-configured a local power grid. They refer to that as islanding the power. They create an island of power in the overall dark grid.
Didn't I read somewhere that did you used to live in the Appalachians?
No, that's not me.
Okay.
You must have been reading about someone else.
Okay. All right, very good. All right, here's a question. Do you know anything about the 1850s event?
Yeah, that's the Carrington event that I mentioned earlier. I believe that took place in like 1857. And in that event, it was an X-class solar flare. It lasted for more than a day, which meant that the Earth took one full rotation while it was under that blast. And the only reason that society held together was because we were living in the very early stages of an electrified society, where there weren't even street lights in those days. It was just telegraph lines were the main electrical devices. And again, they were electrical, not electronic. So the circuitry that was involved was very basic and not particularly vulnerable to a solar flare. Mm-hmm. But in our modern society, just to back up and explain a little bit, virtually everything that we own that's electronic in our homes now has microcircuits in it. Nowadays, if you buy even a washer or a dryer or a toaster, it has microcircuits built into it. And most of those are part and parcel of the basic design of the device. If those microcircuits fail, there's no kind of manual backup. There's no manual switch to make the thing work. And even worse, the microcircuits themselves are becoming more and more vulnerable with each passing year, because to create a chip, a microcircuit, uses a photolithography process, and they're squeezing more and more transistors onto each chip with every passing year because of the scale of the architecture of that lithography process. There's now millions of microcircuits, which means each gate, each little transistor is smaller and closer to other transistors than ever before. And right now, the average gate size, the transistor gate that's seen on each microcircuit, is only about 0.8 of 1 micron. 20 years ago, the average gate was 3 or 4 microns. So we're literally 5 or 10 times more vulnerable to EMP and solar flares than we were 30 years ago. Not because just so many microcircuits are out there, but the microcircuits themselves have so many transistors packed into each integrated circuit, and the gate dimensions are so small that just the tiniest little spark, in fact, even if you mishandle a microcircuit and you're not wearing special grounding straps on your shoes when you're in the factory making these microcircuits, just the tiniest bit of static electricity from a carpet is enough to destroy a microcircuit. That's how vulnerable they are.
James, have you prepared? Do you have preparations for an EMP pulse or a grid down situation?
Yeah, about 2/3 of my electronics are in storage. They're not connected to any power supply, and they're not connected to any antenna. We're also set up for off-grid power here, although we do have a grid-tied system. The ideal system is one that's independent.
Is anything in a Faraday cage?
Well, yes, everything, all my other radios, my spare laptop, all my spare, just about everything, all my spare electronics are they're wrapped in alternating layers of 2 layers of paper and plastic, and then they're put into 30-gallon galvanized steel trash cans with tight-fitting lids. That's all you really need.
James, are you married and have kids?
Yes, I am, and we homeschool our children, and we really enjoy our lifestyle. Even if nothing ever happens, okay, I have absolutely no regrets about having moved out to the boonies. I really enjoy it here, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. We live very self-sufficiently, and the only real threats we face are on 4 legs, not 2.
Well, okay, so that's my question. Does the missus not mind not being able to go to...
She loves all this. Right now she's up to her eyeballs in gardening. Okay. We just butchered 3 cattle earlier this week, and we live the life. We heat our home with firewood. We cut all of our own wood right on our property. We've got a river running through the back end of our property. We pump our water from a depth of only 15 feet on this property. We're basically sitting on a huge aquifer that also sub-irrigates some of our pastures, so we have beautiful, lush pastures. We all have the whole property fenced and cross-fenced. Mm-hmm. We have a large greenhouse. We're pretty well dialed in.
Now, where do you say you live in the Northwest?
Yeah, in the inland Northwest. I live in the region that I refer to as the American Redoubt, which is a safe zone, as you were, that consists of 3 states and half of 2 other states. The American Redoubt region includes Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, and then the eastern half of Oregon and the eastern half of Washington. And if you take a look on Infogalactic, or if you take a look at Wikipedia, for example, you'll see web pages about the American Redoubt region. And again, I picked that region because it's a power exporting area where we produce just millions and millions of watts of hydroelectric power. Okay, and I don't like to mention what particular state that I live in, just for privacy reasons.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. You live in one of those 5 states.
Yes, I'm willing to say that.
Okay, well, we got it narrowed down, man, so we can start hunting you down when the grid goes down. We know you got some goods. And speaking of that, the question came in, which is typically will come in, anybody who is in a survivalist mode. If somebody comes to your door asking for food, because James, they will find you. Somebody will find you, and they may ask you for food. What are you going to do?
Well, in my case, I have about a 3-year supply of food for my family, but I don't really look at that as a 3-year supply for one family. I look at that as a 1-year supply for 3 families, because I'm a Christian and I believe in charity. But as a practical, right-thinking prepper, I also realize human nature being what it is, I don't want people to know that I have a 3-year supply of food, and I intend to dispense that charity in a quiet, humble Christian way, and I'll do it through the elders of my local church in a way that hopefully my name will never get mentioned. And that will accomplish 2 different things. One, it'll protect my privacy, and by indirectly that will protect the safety of my family, because folks won't know that I'm well stocked. And secondly, as a Christian, it's important to be humble. And I don't want to be prideful about dispensing charity. I want it to be done in secret. Mm-hmm. So it's really 2 for the price of 1.
Well, more likely than not, you would come across this kind of the American socialist type, the ones that believed the government was going to be there to take care of them, so they never really had to prep. They never had to do anything. In fact, all they had to really do is mock those that did. Now the mockers have become the beggars. Are they in line for your food distribution?
I'd say everyone is, but more likely, as a Christian, I believe in the Old Testament law of tzedakah, which means you take care of your own family first, then your contiguous neighbors, and then so on, in kind of concentric rings that go outward. Mm-hmm. And in my case, I have very few neighbors. The county that I live in doesn't even have a single stoplight in the county. The population is less than 30,000 people. the state is bigger than Rhode Island. Okay, just one county, and it's so lightly populated that we only have about 2 people per square mile. So, but the number of neighbors that I have to worry about is actually relatively small. The real rub comes for people who are living in the suburbs or the big cities, because you're just elbow to elbow with people, and there it'll be truly a fight for survival. And if someone's trying to hunker down in place in the suburbs, I wish them a lot of luck, because I wouldn't even feel safe cooking dinner for fear of the smell of the food being cooked, escaping and being detected by my neighbors. That's how ugly things could get.
Well, now you realize you've given us some information, and you've told us how far to the nearest store, how far to the nearest city, how big the county is, how many people per square mile. We might be able to Google that and triangulate your location.
There's about 40 or 50 different counties that all fit that description.
Okay.
I can read out.
We're Google.
So I'm not worried about that.
Okay, I'm Google Earth now, trying to locate your position. But no, seriously though, because the people that will create a situation, that have created a situation where the country is vulnerable to various attacks. I mean, excluding the X-class solar flares, a lot of it seems it could be man-made, and that would be the financial end of it.
Or pandemic.
We could have a pandemic, yeah. So that would be also considered man-made, I guess. But but there are those that would want to survive to recreate the kind of civilization we have, which I can't say is particularly good. I mean, we have people at war against each other in this country. As far as I can tell, there's more hatred. I mean, people feel like they have a right to riot and burn and pillage and take other people's stuff. These people they want to survive so they can recreate the civilization that they came from. That's what I always question, whether or not the people that create a civilization where there, say, isn't so much Christianity going on, where there's sort of godlessness, government, communism, basically, they want to recreate that thing. So that's why I wonder why they would be in the same category of, say, helping them out in that situation.
Well, as a Christian, I really have to say that I feel that everyone should be treated equally, and that everyone is deserving of charity. Now, most of my neighbors are very conservative folks, and most of them are Christians or Messianics. And I would not have any compunctions at all about dispensing copious Christian charity to them. Now, a lot of your listeners are living in areas where you have a lot more neighbors, and you're going to be faced with some very tough decisions when everything hits the fan. And all I could say is be prayerful. And if you do have to dispense charity, do it through a third party like a church, so that you can protect your privacy. In my blogs, again at survivalblog.com, we talk a lot about OPSEC, which is a military acronym which stands for Operational Security. And a key part of OPSEC for any prepper is keeping your own preps private. I think that's crucial.
I like that. Last week's guest we had on was Tim Spencer, who's a 100% disabled veteran who also is a survivalist as well. He mentioned that one of the key things that people they should have and practice is situational awareness. So sounds like OPSEC is also a good thing to add to that.
Yep.
All right. Now we have, by the way, to live like you live, and it says in your bio, I guess here, it says former U.S. Army intelligence officer. Are you retired?
No, I just served about 7.5 years. I resigned my commission the day that Bill Clinton was sworn into office. At that point, my 6-year obligation had long since passed, and I simply resigned my commission because I didn't like the idea of him being my commander-in-chief. So a lot of my classmates, folks who were commissioned in my same year group, right now are retiring as full colonels and even brigadier generals. I kind of regret not staying in, even if I could have done my full 20 in the U.S. Army Reserve. But I don't regret at all taking the moral stand to resign my commission when Bill Clinton came into office.
Well, I disowned him as my president when he started talking about cigar penetration. I mean, at that point there, I had no use for the man myself. All right, so do you have an income, or do you generate income from your farm situation?
Well, actually, our farm is more or less a self-sufficiency measure. Mm-hmm. You know, we grow a few crops. We don't actually grow row crops on our property. We have a lot of pasture here. We have a large greenhouse. We raise poultry, we raise cattle, we have a few horses, we've got some small livestock as well. But all of those measures are basically for self-sufficiency. Any excess that we have from that just goes to charity. It usually goes to like some of the widows in our church, for example. Mm-hmm. I don't really look at that as a cash income. Most of my income comes from my blog, specifically from the advertising that goes on my blog, and from some residuals from my books. I've actually had 3 novels that were New York Times bestsellers.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you do have an income. So it is, even though you have obviously, it sounds like an idyllic situation there, but it takes cash. It still takes cash.
Oh, sure does. Yeah. In fact, I recommend that people develop a home-based business before they ever consider relocating to the Hinterboonies. You know, it's great living in the Hinterboonies, but it's not great if you can't make a living. So develop a home-based business first. Get that business off the ground. Get a good, solid cash flow from that business before you relocate. Because otherwise, the only other folks that I recommend relocating would be someone who's retiring, who has a retirement income.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, all right. So you can retire. So I guess you want to retire closer to the collapse.
Well, yeah, that's all a matter of timing then, but nobody knows when this is going to hit, and it takes a long time to establish a retreat that's functional from a self-sufficiency standpoint. You can't just hit the ground running and say, I'm going to grow a garden for my family and have 0 grocery bills starting next year. Mm-hmm. That's just not realistic. Yeah. You know, it takes time to build up your soil. Mm-hmm. To build up a big compost pile, to have livestock so you have a source of manure, mm-hmm. There's so many things that have a learning curve to them, whether it's, cooking on a wood stove or off-grid power or you name it. I mean, there's learning curves to all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And for some things like developing fruit and nut trees or an asparagus bed, takes years to develop. Well, you're not going to do that overnight. So I recommend that people start developing a rural retreat now, that they get through those learning curves and become self-sufficient as soon as possible. I don't try to time it to get out of Dodge at the last minute. It's just not realistic.
Do you know who John Moore is?
Of course, yeah. Okay. He's a godly man and a decorated Vietnam veteran. And I respect him. Yeah,
when he was on this program, he was saying that if somebody's asking when, it's too late for them.
Right.
He said.
Right.
He just said next question because they'll never be ready.
Yeah. One of my good friends runs a prepping company. His name is Bob Griswold, and he runs a company called Ready Made Resources out of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And he's fond of saying, "Panic now and avoid the rush."
All right. And there was a semi-panic not too long ago. Did the government start ordering prep food in mass quantities?
Yeah, that was back in the early days of the Obama administration, and people were concerned because companies like Mountain House that packages freeze-dried foods was receiving these huge orders from the federal government, and it actually added to shortages that already existed because there were a lot of people prepping at the time. Mm-hmm. Most people don't realize it, but this long-term storage food industry is very small, and a lot of it is mom and pop companies, and it doesn't take much. Right now, those companies are selling products to about 1 or 2% of the population. all it would take is 5% of the population to wake up and place orders for a 2-year food supply, and they'd be absolutely overwhelmed. The waiting list for back ordering these foods would stretch to 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, almost immediately. They would just get overwhelmed. And because they're small companies, they can't just instantly hire staff and double, triple, or quadruple their production. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, James, listen, we're at the top of the hour. We'll take a 5-minute break. I want you to tell us about survivalblog.com one more time before we go to break.
Sure. Survival Blog is a family preparedness blog that's been out for 12 years. There's over 50,000 archived articles, letters, and column items. And again, it's all available free of charge. I recommend that people plunge into it. I'm not here just to sell books. I'm also here to recommend that families get prepared, and they can do so free of charge by going to survivalblog.com.
All right. James, stay on the line there. We'll turn you down, and we'll be back with you in 5 minutes. All right?
Sounds great.
All right, everybody, you're watching and or listening to the Edge television broadcast. Tonight, our guest is, of course, James Wesley Rawles, talking about survival, or how to survive the coming collapse. And it could come in many forms. Stay with us. We'll be back with you in 5 minutes. We'll be right back. Back with us, James Wesley Rawles. James, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, we had a lot of good questions in the first half. Let's just start you out in the second half with some more questions that came in. And it's going to be about the firearms. James, do you have some ammunition and some other items of note?
Sure. Like most preppers, I'm pretty well armed, and I actually consider ammunition to be the ideal barter item. You know, a lot of people spend a lot of money buying gold and silver coins and other items for barter, when I think their money could be much better invested in common caliber ammunition. If everything hits the fan, I think that's what everyone's going to be looking for. You could never have too much of it. People are always going to want to barter for it. And one of the great things about ammunition is it's divisible. You can take a box of 50 22 long rifle cartridges, and that could be 20 or 30 transactions. So it's ideal for barter. You just, again, want to get ammunition that's common caliber. So things like 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson, maybe some 45 ACP and 357 Magnum for handguns.
All right.
And for rifles, things like 223, 7.62 Russian, the AK cartridge, 7.62 NATO, which is also known as 308 Winchester, and 30-06, for example. And then for shotguns, just standard 12-gauge and 20-gauge slugs, buckshot, and birdshot. It's pretty simple. Oh, and of course, lots and lots of 22.
So you're saying I can take me a box of 22s, go to McDonald's and trade it in for a Big Mac?
Not right now, but when the Schumer hits the fan, it's conceivable that a lot of local businesses will switch to barter, and it'll either be common caliber ammunition or small silver coins, things like dimes and quarters. And of course, we're talking pre-1965 dimes and quarters that will be changing hands if the dollar is wiped out as a currency unit.
I always say I always use the acronym when Hillary hits the fan, but I don't know. I guess some people.
I'll say when the Schumer hits the fan because I don't like to use the crude version of that.
Yeah, I mean, now I know Anderson Cooper just used some crude verbiage talking about Donald Trump the other day, so he had to apologize for that. All right, let's get to another question here. It says, James, do you grow your own medicines, such as special herbs in your farm?
Well, yeah, we have over the years grown echinacea. We grow our own dandelion root. We have several different herbs that we've grown over the years. And I also have a colloidal silver generator. So I think it's important that people plan ahead for disruption of the supply chains where pharmacies are not going to get restocked and you have to depend on yourself. So that means a lot more than just bandages. You need to have antibiotics as well. And one of my favorites is colloidal silver.
Okay.
And I'm also a big believer in valerian. Valerian root is excellent as a natural muscle relaxant, and it's not addictive or habit forming. And I also, of course, have stocked up very heavily on vitamins, on various supplements, and painkillers like aspirin and Tylenol and such.
No, that's a good barter stuff right there too, isn't it?
Sure, yeah. Aspirin may actually be in demand after a while. Most families are sitting on a supply of basic painkillers, probably enough for a year or two. But it's some of the more exotic things that people will, they'd probably be willing to give a fortune for some inhalable insulin, for example. Mm-hmm. I don't have any of that on hand, but for anyone who has stocked up, they might be in a great position for either charity or barter.
So how long have you been stocking up?
Since about 1976.
Wow.
So quite a while. In terms of earnestly, I didn't have a decent income until the early 1980s or late 80s. And it wasn't until then that I could really stock up in earnest. But I've been gradually stocking up ever since. I keep what I call JASBOR, which stands for Jim's Amazing Secret Bunker of Redundant Redundancy. And in the JASBOR, we stock everything from paper products to common caliber ammunition, lots and lots of storage food, and a few other barter items in quantity.
Which is also helping me in my triangulation of your location. I'm looking for stores that have been selling large quantities of ammo. So I'm getting closer to your location there, James.
A lot of really crucial supplies. I am very careful not to leave any paper trail behind, and I recommend the same for your listeners. I mean this in all seriousness, folks. If you're buying firearms, if you live in a state that does not require a paper trail for the purchase of a secondhand firearm from another private party, then that's the only way you should be buying your guns. You should not be buying them at a gun shop where you're filling out a Form 4473. You should be buying those guns from either from newspaper ads or at gun shows or from any of the internet sites like gunbroker.com or Auction Arms, for example, where you can link up with people who are inside of your own state, because that's the only legal way to buy a post-1898 firearm legally is inside of your own state. That's the only way you can legally buy it with no paper trail. Because if it comes from out of state, technically it has to go through an FFL. And, of course, if you buy it from a brick-and-mortar firearms dealer, they're going to make you fill out a 4473 whether the gun is new or used.
All right. Here's a question. It says, with the coming collapse of the United States, why do you live here? Why didn't you simply move to a safe place in the world?
The problem is there's precious few states, few nation states that I would consider living in. The United States is not a perfect country, let's face it, but we still have a relatively free press. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of religion. We have a functioning economy. We have a court system that is not totally corrupt. But if you go to live overseas, there are very few countries where you have all of those freedoms, all those opportunities, where you have a functioning economy, where you have a decent currency, although ours is being slowly inflated away, and most importantly, the right to keep and bear arms. Most of the tax haven countries that people tout on the internet, you can't even buy a gun in those countries. And especially as a resident alien rather than a native-born citizen, your chances of getting a firearm are just about zero. So why would I move to a country overseas where I would either have to deal with corrupt police or with wouldn't have the opportunity to defend myself, or I wouldn't have private banking, or there's so many trade-offs all over the world, Daniel. And I have yet to find a country that I would rather live in than the United States.
All right. Another question from the live chat for you from Pick and Steel. He says, James, do you have special skills that give you better barter skills than, say, others? Is that something you think you'd be good at?
I would say a few, mainly in the self-sufficiency arena, and I'm also a former Army intelligence officer. So I also had, basic combat arms training as well. So I understand small unit tactics and security, how to run patrols, how to do ambushes, all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I suppose I would have a few more marketable skills than most folks. But rather than skills, I'm actually depending more on my network of friends and the jazz bore, that bunker full of barterable goods. Because just to back up a little bit, even the very best prepper in the world, someone who's been at it for as long as I have, for 30 plus years, is still going to overlook something, no matter how well they plan. And that's why it's really important that you have some barter items so that you can make up for those shortcomings. Mm-hmm. There might be a particular piece of hardware that I need to assemble something or whatever, and I'll be short. Mm-hmm. But if I have common caliber ammunition or silver dimes or quarters, at least I'll have the opportunity to barter.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's probably one thing that I'm guessing that you're lacking, and it's a big part of your survival, James. You probably haven't thought of this, but you need to have a supply of downloaded Edge broadcast YouTube videos. So, that's the only way you can survive.
It's funny you mentioned that. But one of the advertisers on my blog produces what's called the Internet Archive. And it's a 2 terabyte hard drive that contains not just the entire Wikipedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica and hundreds of other books and reference articles, but it also includes video clips on practical skills, for example. Mm-hmm. I do believe that people should have both a hard copy archive and an electronic archive. And that electronic archive should be primarily on USB memory sticks. I'm not a big believer in having all your eggs in one basket with a big 2 or 3.
By the way, James, I've got to question some of the marketing of long-term food storages.
Sure.
Whenever I go to those websites, I look and they always show this happy family sitting around like the world just melted down, as in chaos, and they're sitting around and they have dessert,
eating macaroni.
They're macaroni. Right. They got video games. There's I'm not seeing that. That's what's going to happen.
No, I think, if things do fall apart, for most Americans, life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short. Mm-hmm. If the grid goes down, all bets are off. It's going to be a really nasty, ugly existence for several years during the period of a die-off. Mm-hmm. And no one is going to enjoy it. Even for someone like me who lives a very isolated life, I'm still probably going to have trouble sleeping at night, and we're going to have to run 24-hour security at our ranch. Yeah. So it's not going to be any fun by any stretch of the imagination. I am not looking forward to this at all. My fondest hope is that there is no collapse and that I could just quietly continue to rotate through my storage food. Mm-hmm. And someday my grandchildren will simply inherit a wonderful gun collection.
All right. Here's an interesting question I've never seen posed from Mike out of the live chat. It says, is there ever a point when you would choose not to survive?
Actually, no, because I have children and grandchildren to worry about. And I will do everything I can to survive to, in turn, ensure their survival. Because we have to have a functioning retreat.
James,
I would never commit suicide simply because things were depressing. Mm-hmm. No, I wouldn't do that. And I've prepared for everything up to and including full-scale nuclear war. Wow. So I cannot foresee any circumstance where I would take my own life. No.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. I don't know who this person is, but I'm just going to ask you the question because it came in. So if you may know, it says, "What would you do if Negan shows up at your compound?" Is that somebody you know, have heard of?
No, I don't know who she is. Okay. Now, if Hurricane Megan were to come sweeping across my
I didn't know either. I'm not sure what the nature of that one would be. All right. Well, now this is now look. There's a lot of scenarios out there, as you said, pandemics, X factor, solar flares, EMP pulse, nuclear war, chaos, but there's always the possibility of an alien attack. What
You know,
kind of
it's
preps? What's your preparations for that?
Well, partly simply because of the logistics of interstellar space travel.
Okay.
Even if faster than light travel were possible, which I have doubts,
Okay.
the sheer logistics of mounting an invasion-sized fleet of ships simply to take over another planet with limited resources
Well,
just doesn't make any sense. I can't imagine any intelligent life form wanting to do that unless they were in a situation where they completely depleted their own resources. And at that point, they probably wouldn't be in the logistical position to mount such an attack.
well, if they don't exist, who the heck is it that is abducting people at night and performing hideous sexual experiments on them?
I have my doubts about that as well. Let's just say I'm dubious. How's that?
Okay. Well, I was too, but there was the Stevensville sighting, and there were officers, ranchers, police, preacher, various people, workers that all saw this craft about a mile wide fly over. I mean, something went over there. I mean, is it perhaps that the government has devices that they use, and maybe they're getting ready for the
possible.
Planet X?
I think that if the UFO sightings that have been reported are legitimate, it is more likely that those have actually been current technology from the Earth, or possibly time traveling ships from the future using future technology. I think that's much more likely than them actually being alien craft.
All right. Okay. So we got you into some kind of conspiracy there. You would go with time travel.
Possibly, yes.
Okay.
I have an open mind, and the physics of that actually are less daunting than the physics of faster than light travel. Because to go FTL, especially if you're going to involve a wormhole, means shrinking your ship down to about the size of an atom by the time it passes through a black hole. So how are you going to come through that?
Alrighty. I've got one of your books in our background now, How to Survive the End of the World as We Know It. What is in that book?
That's a nonfiction book that Penguin published. In fact, it's still in print. It's now in its 20th printing. It's been one of their bestsellers over the years. It never made the New York Times bestseller list, but it's a nonfiction book that talks about basically the tactics and techniques of technologies of surviving a global collapse. So basically everything we've been talking about here tonight spelled out in detail.
All right, and now I've got another book, Liberators. What is that book about?
Liberators was the fourth or fifth book in fifth book in my Patriots novel series. That one is set primarily in western British Columbia, and it is a continuation of my Patriots novel series. The Patriots series is kind of unusual in that most book series follow the same characters farther and farther out into the future. With my series, I made them all contemporaneous, and I had different characters in different geography, all going through the same collapse in the same time period. So that same exciting first few years of the global collapse, but from the perspective of people from different economic backgrounds, from people who had military experience and some who had none, people who were very well prepared and some who weren't prepared, some who were mentally prepared but didn't have physical prep set aside. So I used all those books in that series as teaching tools. They're essentially survival manuals dressed as fiction. And the whole idea is that people read those books twice, the first time through for fun, and the second time through with a notepad in their hand taking notes.
All right.
And again, 3 of those have been New York Times bestsellers.
What do you know about Morgellons?
Morgellon?
Yeah, Morgellons, yes.
Are you talking about?
That's a question. I don't know what it says. How you feel about it? So I guess you probably don't like it. I would say.
Are you talking about the Morgellon disease?
Well, I'm not sure. We're going to need some clarification, but let's just move on to this question. Oh, and this goes into the possibility collapse scenario. The planet Nibiru or the Planet X, is that a possibility?
Yeah, it is in about 20 years.
Okay.
But for anyone who says Planet X has been spotted just outside of the orbit of Pluto and it's going to be here next year.
All right. On September.
They've got to be an imbecile, because if something is moving at planetary speed and it's out in the vicinity of Pluto, the orbit of Pluto is measured in hundreds of years. And even if Pluto were to somehow turn an immediate right-hand turn and start heading to the Earth at planetary speed,
it can happen.
Then it would only take 12 years to reach the Earth. That's at planetary speed. Mm-hmm. So for someone to say Nibiru is going to come bearing down on the Earth in 1 year or less, the astrophysics of it are just not there. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, if I am quite concerned, however, about a unidentified asteroid that's already in the orbital sphere of the asteroid belt, suddenly showing up or maybe even hitting us without any warning. That is a real and present danger.
Is it possible that Planet X is wormwood?
In the biblical sense of the term, mm-hmm. I don't think so. No.
Okay.
But whenever I hear talk about Nibiru or Planet X, I kind of take it with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. If someone were to show me with the astrophysics to back it up that somehow there's a planet that's been lurking and that has escaped our notice and that could be inside of the orbit of Mars within the next 3 years, then I'd be worried. Mm-hmm. But at this point, I don't see how any large body that would threaten the Earth could be inside of the orbit of Mars, because even if it was moving at planetary speed and it was within at the same distance as Mars right now, and for some weird reason, because it had an albedo of 0.0001, mm-hmm. Because it was practically black, so it didn't show up against the star field. Okay. If it was moving at planetary speed, if it's in the vicinity of Mars, it would take more than 2 or 3 years just to reach the Earth. So, and for anyone to claim, it's just outside of the orbit of Pluto, well, that's, 12, 14-year journey minimum mm-hmm. at planetary speed. Mm-hmm. So I think people just need to sit back, take a chill pill, and apply some common sense astrophysics to this.
All right. Out of the live chat, question comes, says, can you give us some bartering tactics?
Okay, well, I think the most important bartering tactic is, A, have barterable items on hand. B, make sure they're things that you don't absolutely need yourself.
Okay.
C, never barter hard items for soft items. And by that I mean, say you have a tool mm-hmm. or ammunition or something that needs to be manufactured and requires modern technology to produce, like, say, a 9-volt battery. Okay? You can't just whip up a 9-volt battery in your garage. There's some technology involved and some chemistry involved and some metallurgy involved.
Okay.
So you wouldn't take a hard item like that, a manufactured item, what they call hard good, and trade it for something soft, like food, unless you're trading it at a great advantage. Mm-hmm. Same for ammunition. Okay. Same for any manufactured device. Certainly something as valuable as a firearm. You would want to trade a tremendous amount of soft goods for a hard good. And say you had a firearm that costs $400 right now.
Okay.
To trade it for the equivalent of $400 worth of food in a disaster situation would be absolutely foolish, because you can produce food, you can grow food, you can breed livestock and they produce offspring, and you can have that $400 worth of beef or whatever pretty easily. You can't just whoop up a modern semi-automatic firearm in your garage and with any reasonable expectation that it's going to be reliable. So you don't barter hard for soft unless it's going to be at a huge advantage. We're talking 5 or 10 times its value in nominal dollar value terms. So that's my primary advice on barter.
All right. And what are several must-have items?
Well, I first have a Bible and read it and get right with God. Second, you need to have a water filter for every family, and preferably 2.
Okay.
You'd have a compact filter that would be in your get out of Dodge or bug out bag.
Okay.
And that would be a compact filter like a Kataydin combi filter, for example, and then a large filter for a whole house type filter or a kitchen counter type filter, and that would be a large ceramic type filter like a Big Berkey.
Okay.
Water filtration is an absolute must, because in a disaster situation, unless you're blessed with plentiful water and you have a spring right on your own property,
right,
or a reliable well, a shallow well that you can hand pump, odds are you're going to have to be gathering water from open sources, and that means you need to be able to treat that water. Well, first you need to transport that water. If you can't pipe it to your property, you're going to have to transport it, and you have to plan ahead for a situation where there'll be no gasoline available.
Right.
So you need more than just containers. You're also going to need something like a 2-wheeled garden cart to transport it to your home, and then once you have it at your home,
okay,
you're going to need a water filtration to treat that water.
Okay.
And then beyond water filtration, of course, storage food. And you want to have shelf-stable food that's going to be at least a 3-month supply for your family. I think 3 or 4 years is more like it. I mentioned a 3-year supply here at our ranch. That didn't include anything that we produce on a day-to-day basis in terms of our livestock, our gardens, or game. We have hot and cold running elk here. So, we have plenty of wild game to shoot. We've got fish in our river, but that 3-year supply that I quoted didn't include any of that. So from a practical standpoint, we could live much, much longer.
As far as game goes, there's a whole lot of other people going to be in that forest looking to kill some animals, all right?
Right. So unless you're in a very lightly populated area like I am, the wild game is going to get spooked in the first month and be very hard to hunt, and people shouldn't count on that at all. I only look at deer and elk as a nice bonus.
Do you foresee in a collapse scenario that people revert to cannibalism?
Oh, in an absolute worst case, yes, they will, and it'll primarily be in the big cities. I don't intend to be anywhere near there.
Oh, why not? You're not going to have you wouldn't have a weekend shopping trip there?
No, no, thank you.
I've always seen these
gate and hunker down.
I've always seen these end time movies where like groups of people they come from the forest or wherever, and they make their way into the city looking for the last pieces of things, but there's always killers running around. So just don't go there. There's always killers running around there.
Yeah.
But so all right.
Yeah,
So
in fact, you mentioned something fairly important, Daniel, and that is in the mass media they often show survival situations where people are wandering from place to place. And if there's one thing that my life in Army intelligence taught me is the last thing you want to be is a refugee. The life of refugees is measured in days or weeks, and statistically your chances are very, very small. And the last thing that I want to do is wander from ambush to ambush and be at the mercy of my environment. I would much rather hunker down in one place with a team of people that I can count on, well stocked, with 360-degree, 24-hour-a-day security, and not move. And if I need to barter I'll barter right across the fence with my neighbors. I'm not going to leave my property probably for the first 2 or 3 years of a crunch. Mm-hmm. And then if I do leave, it will be under a military convoy style situation.
So you don't think your neighbors would turn on you?
Well-armed group of people, if we're going to go into town to barter. I'm not going to go wandering around by myself. That's just a good opportunity to get myself shot up.
So you have full confidence that your neighbors in that situation wouldn't turn on you?
My neighbors wouldn't, because most of them, the standing joke in my neighborhood is that everyone owns a country living grain mill. All my neighbors are stocked up.
Wow.
In the American Redoubt, the region where I live, the majority of people live self-sufficiency. Nearly everyone cuts their own firewood, has a garden, and hunts or fishes. So a lot of people in this area really don't have much of a cash income at all. Mm-hmm. They make their money by picking huckleberries or gathering morels in the spring. That's a wild fungus that restaurants buy.
They're not a bunch of them on disability, are they?
There's a few people on disability, but most of the people in my region,
they understand that those checks will stop coming, right?
Well, yes, and but you can count those people on one hand within a 20-mile radius of my ranch. The vast majority of the people in that 20-mile radius are good, honest, productive families, and most of them live on ranches much bigger than mine. They would laugh at my little herd. So they're not going to be hurting for much of anything, except for, a few really choice barter goods, because in terms of protein, they've got it on the hoof. And most folks garden here as well. And I live in a northern region. I live in the inland Northwest. So the only way to have a decent garden here, because the growing season is so unpredictable, is to have a greenhouse, and that's pretty much the norm. Most of my.
By the way, just to be clear, I'm not dissing people on disability. I'm just saying.
No, but I agree with you. Anyone who's on disability and anyone who buys their groceries with an EBT card, that's the replacement for food stamps, is part of the problem. And I really believe that people should plan ahead and recognize the fact that a lot of those people are going to turn into looters, and they may not be on your doorstep looking for charity. Mm-hmm. They may be there with a gun in their hand. Mm-hmm. So, folks, you really need to plan ahead. And again, the lower the population density, the farther you are from the big cities, and the farther you are off the beaten track. You don't want to be right on a highway. Yeah. You want to be on a side road of a side road, because when the looters and the refugees come wandering around, they're going to be on the highways.
Right.
Okay, you don't want to be on a highway.
You don't want to be anywhere near a highway.
Side road of the side road, you're probably never going to hear about them. You might hear some shooting in the distance, but the chances of them ever making it to your place are slim.
Right.
And if they do, well, then you need to be ready for them.
All right, and be ready is a good thing. But the amount of by the way, what is your closest city?
Which city? I can't mention that. But the nearest city from me is about 80 miles.
80 miles. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I know you're busy with a compass in your hand, drawing radiuses on a map, right?
Yes, actually I am. I actually am. I've held it up. I don't know if you're watching the show, but I've held it up a couple of times already. I've got somebody who's buying a lot of guns, uses cash mainly, a large county the size of Rhode Island. Takes an hour to get to a Walmart.
But I didn't say how much bigger than Rhode Island. That could be 2 Rhode Islands. It could almost be a Delaware. Okay, so somewhere in that range, yeah. But,
I'm getting closer. But when you the things that you listed, James, it sounds to me like that's in the values of thousands of dollars. Is that what it's going to take for somebody to survive? I mean, most people don't have that kind of cash sitting around.
Well, it took me many, many years to do this. But I've got to tell you, Daniel, for your listeners out there, even if you just set aside a 6-month supply of food, that puts you in the top 1% of preppers in the United States.
How much?
And it's going to quadruple or quintuple your chances of survival.
Well, give me that percent again. What now?
Well, only through. Oh, if you have just a 3-month supply or 6-month supply of food, that puts you in the top 1% of the population in terms of preparedness. Because your average American family has a whopping 3-day supply of food on hand. Mm-hmm. That's like 70-80% of the population only has a 3-day supply.
James, you haven't seen my
pitiful figure. So even just by preparing a little, just a 6-month supply is going to quadruple or quintuple your chances of survival. So, folks, do it. Stock up.
James, you obviously haven't seen my refrigerator. Right now, I think I have 10 eggs and a pack of cheese in there. So, am I good? Am I covered? And I have some.
You haven't told me about the pallet loads of MREs in your garage.
I do have some chili though in a can, but I don't know. Seems like I'm a little shy of my goal.
You are a bit shy, and I hate to say it, but from an actuarial standpoint, the folks who are behind the scenes at insurance companies are called actuaries, and they're a special type of accountant that runs the numbers and figures out people's chances of surviving any particular accident or whatever, or any particular situation. From an actuarial standpoint, again, anyone who has a 6-month food supply is going to have a much, much, much greater chance of survival. So please, folks, at least do that.
Mm-hmm. All right. A couple quick questions in it. Here's one from our live chat again. It says, are you ever concerned that the government would come in and confiscate your stock?
Absolutely. And that's why I try to live very privately, very humbly, and I don't keep all my eggs in one basket. So I think it's wise that people who do stock up are very quiet about what they do, that they don't store all of it in their home, and that if you're going to build a root cellar, for example, that you build it a distance from your home and that you camouflage it, and that the entrance stairway to your root cellar should have a wood pile over it, and you shouldn't get in there very often. Mm-hmm. It should be completely gray man, as they say, where you kind of blend in with your neighbors, mm-hmm. and if someone does come looking for your food supply, they'll find the 2 or 3 week supply that's sitting on your pantry shelf, but they're not going to find your root cellar that's stocked full of everything else.
Hey, I've got in my background now another one of your books called Founders. And mm-hmm. It's obviously it looks like a military man going down a railroad track heading to a bridge. Mm-hmm. That spookily or eerily reminds me of a movie I saw on Netflix. The scenario is the world has broken down and it's freezing cold, and there's a bridge that goes between that community where people are holed up, and then on the other side of the bridge is all the kooks and freaks and killers that are just roaming the countryside, killing everybody, taking their stuff. And so finally they try to blow the bridge up so they can't cross, but I think eventually they find a way across. So that kind of reminds me of that. But that's a full military armament there. So, I mean, are the military people going to have a better chance of surviving than, say, the city folk type people that are trying to live out in the country?
It takes a lot of things altogether. It takes training, it takes teamwork, and it takes logistics, and a bit of communications to go along with it.
Well, now that's good you said that,
because just by itself is not going to help you, not necessarily going to ensure your survival. You need to have the teamwork, the training, and the logistics. You have to have a complete package like that, or you're really going to be short.
In that, you talk about roving hordes, and talk about the military. Are they still in existence at this time? Are they trying to restore order? What are they doing?
In my Patriots novel series, I described a situation where most military units have completely fallen apart because they no longer have a functioning payroll. Mm-hmm. Most people don't realize it, but most military units don't have anything more than a very short-term supply of food for training operations. Mm-hmm. They have a few pallets of MREs sitting there. Once those are gone, how are you going to feed the troops? How are you going to keep them there? Mm. So
that's a whole other group you have to worry about.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you.
You could end up with a situation where you have some people with the training and small arms, or maybe even something bigger, maybe full-up military vehicles with turrets, mm-hmm. wandering the countryside, but with no food in their bellies. That's a bad situation.
You mentioned communications a few seconds ago, and that brings us to this question. What about disaster communications?
Well, I think it's crucial because, one thing that the Army taught me was to be functional, to be a real viable threat on the battlefield, an Army needs to do three things. It needs to move, shoot, and communicate.
Okay.
And the communication part of that is crucial because communications is what the military refers to as a force multiplier. If you're in direct contact with other maneuvering units, it gives you a huge advantage over an opponent who doesn't have good communications because you can use that communication to strategize and develop tactics to maneuver against your opponent and outflank them. So communications are crucial. In the context of a survival retreat, communications are really important because you need to have a neighborhood watch on steroids. You need to be able to talk to your neighbors, even if the grid power is down, cell phones are down, and your landline telephones are down. Mm-hmm. So plan ahead, buy yourself some military surplus field phones like TA-1s or TA-312s or DNVTs. You need to have landline communications and you need to have radio communications. And the radio communications that I recommend for coordinating security on a neighborhood level or out in the countryside is a push-to-talk solution called MERS. MERS stands for Multiple Use Radio Service, MERS. It's a band that's right near the CB band, but it does not overlap with the CB band.
Yeah.
And it's also right next to it's right next to 2 meters, and it's also right next to the National Weather Service frequencies. Mm-hmm. If you have a MERS handheld walkie-talkie,
all right,
it's only a couple of watts, but it's much more reliable than a little 500 milliwatt, bubble pack radio that you get from Radio Shack. It's got 4 times the power. It's in a fairly lightly used band, which means it's not going to be crowded with panicky traffic in the event of a disaster, especially if you're out in the countryside. And that same radio can be used for push-to-talk. Mm-hmm. You can have an extra channel programmed into it so you can hear the National Weather Service weather alert frequency. And that same MERS band is used by the makers of a home security system called Dakota Alert. Mm-hmm. And a Dakota Alert is an infrared intrusion detection system. Most people use them for driveway alarms to let them know when UPS is arriving at their driveway when they live out in the country. And when our Dakota Alert goes off, it'll say Alert Zone 2 or Alert Zone 1, and it'll let us know which of those sensors has gone off. But the nice thing is because it's on the MERS band, those alerts are coming in on the same handheld walkie-talkie that we carry on our belt here at our ranch. So not only can we push to talk, but it's also going to warn us when someone's coming through the front gate or by a trail down on the river or wherever. So I prefer the MERS band, and folks can research that, again, on my blog at survivalblog.com. Just in the search box in the upper right-hand corner of my blog, type in MERS, MERS, and it'll give you all the details on those radios, how to find them. And again, there's no license required for that band, so I consider it absolutely ideal for coordinating security with your neighbors. Again, you're going to need a neighborhood watch on steroids.
When Obama hits the fan, and I would assume we don't have to pay property taxes anymore, but what's the county that you pay taxes to? I forgot.
I wouldn't want to mention that county, but I do live in a county. I will mention that. I don't live in a province, and I don't live in a parish. So that leaves just the counties in the United States, which narrows it down to only about 4,000. Mm-hmm. So you are narrowing your sights in on me there.
All righty. Okay. So now here's an interesting question. Let's get a little spiritual here. I like to do that on the edge. This question came in. With all the planning and survival, aren't you just delaying the inevitable? For isn't it appointed unto man once to die?
Well, I do believe as a Christian that we need to be right with God. And we never know when our appointed day will come. We know we do need to be prepared to meet our Maker. And I do seriously believe that everyone who is listening to this right now, who recognizes the fact that they're not saved, needs to repent of their sin, get right with Christ, because you can't expect to survive a situation like this and receive God's covenant blessings unless you're in covenant with God. Mm-hmm. Think about that, folks. You've got to be in the covenant to receive the covenant blessings. So if you've never been saved before, or if you're a backslidden Christian, it's time to get right with Christ.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is, of course, in the Christian community at large, the belief that God's going to take care of me. Why do I need a plan at all?
I think he has, and I think he will continue to. I think he will protect his covenant people. Mm-hmm. But people need to listen to the urgings of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And if you feel convicted after prayer to move to a lightly populated region and prepare your family, don't hesitate. Make that move. Mm-hmm. That is God looking out for you. You know, there's the old story about, the guy in the middle of the flood who's on his rooftop and a boat comes by and he tells the people on the boat, I'm not worried. God's going to protect me. God's going to protect me.
Right.
And then another boat comes by and the water's getting higher and the people in the boat offer to take him to safety. He says, no, God will look after me. I trust in God. And finally, the water's up to his neck and another boat comes by. And that's the end of it for him. And he goes to heaven and he meets his Maker. And God says, well, I sent 3 boats.
Yes, and that is exactly right. Well, along that line of that questioning there, I want to continue. If you obviously have prepared and you have lengthened your time on the earth, somebody who hasn't prepared, have they changed the appointed time of their death?
Well, no, I don't think they have, because God has full prescience. He knows exactly when everyone will die, and he knows exactly who is among his elect. Mm-hmm. So that hasn't changed that, because God is changeless and God is all-knowing. He is known since the foundations of the earth when each man would die and the spiritual state of each of those men, because he has elected some of us to saving faith.
So can a person change their appointed time?
I don't believe so, no.
So then he would already have known, and he would already have known that.
God would already know that. See, God would already know that we, say, someone like me was a prepper, and he would know when I would die, and hopefully that will be at a ripe old age, quietly in my bed.
All right, we've mentioned several end time scenarios: pandemics, solar flares, chaos, mass destruction. I even threw in aliens, but there is one category of catastrophe, doomgasms, end time scenarios we haven't discussed, and that is, of course, the pandemic that caused the rise of the zombies. What do you have to fight them off, James?
I've got plenty, but from a medical standpoint, the whole concept of reanimated flesh rather escapes me. Since it's scientifically impossible, I don't know why so many people waste so much time thinking about zombies. Once something dies, it's dead. And life springs from life, not from death. That's what the Bible teaches us, and that's what science also teaches us.
However, many people rose from the dead in the Bible. Is it possible?
I'm not expecting Lazarus to end up on my doorstep.
No, but the devil, who always has a copy, he's a copycatter, basically, and a deceiver. Is it possible that him and his hordes would be able to use the technology of some sort to reanimate dead things?
I rather doubt it, but I do think that people need to be serious about the threat posed by the devil and his legions, because there are such, and the devil is alive and well, and he's affecting the affairs of men. And again, people need to be right with Christ.
James, how would somebody know if the devil is operating in their life?
Well, I think it's self-evident. If you look at the sinfulness of man, and you look at the level of depravity that exists in our own civilization, in our own society, the amount of pedophilia, the number of murders, the number of people who are chronically addicted to drugs, I think all point back to Satan and Satan's forces.
Is Satan winning the battle?
No, he's not, because we've read the last chapter of the book. We know how it ends. It ends well, and I sleep well at night knowing that. But in the meantime, in the interim, things could be very ugly, and I recognize that we live in a society that has just really a thin veneer of civilization, and it doesn't take much to peel that back. You start peeling back the layers of that onion, and it's pretty smelly underneath. And that, again, that's why I encourage your listeners to get right with God and move to a lightly populated region where the chances of them having to confront that face to face in the event of a societal collapse will be minimal.
I am just not quite done with that. James, what do you mean, for those in our audience who don't know what you're talking about? How do they know how to get right with God? What does that mean?
Well, you need to recognize that Christ truly is the Son of God, that he did indeed die on that cross. He rose from the dead on the third day, that he now is seated at the right hand of God, and that he is coming back in judgment. And people need to recognize that. They need to accept Christ as their personal Savior. And the beauty of the gospel message is that that saving faith is available to anyone. Anyone who accepts Christ is saved the moment they accept Christ, and they can never lose that salvation. And that blessed assurance is a wonderful thing. And for anyone who's not yet experienced that, I recommend that they admit that they're a sinner, get down on their knees, repent of that sin, recognize the divinity of Christ, and accept him as their personal Savior. It's just that simple.
And you would say that is probably maybe the single best thing somebody can do for their survival?
Absolutely. I think that is the most important preparation for any man or woman listening to this right now, is to get right with Christ.
And would you also say then that, by extension, that if one were to do that, because you mentioned a few minutes ago that, say, if the Spirit leads you to somewhere or to do something, but if say you haven't accepted Christ, you would not hear that voice. You would hear the other guy. You'd be listening to the other guy's voice, and the other guy wants to destroy you. Is that right?
Right. And again, you cannot expect God's covenantal blessings unless you're in covenant with God. So if any prepper who has good spiritual discernment has to recognize they need to be in covenant with God. And the way you get there is by accepting Christ as your personal Savior.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, that is an awesome way to end this show here. James, tell us a little bit about your blog again one more time.
Sure. It's called survivalblog.com. And again, all the content is available there free of charge. There's a search box in the upper right-hand corner. Our archives are deep and rich. I've got to warn folks, don't start into this at 9 o'clock at night, because you'll probably be up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Start out some Saturday or Sunday morning when you have time, and go through the archives and print out the most important articles for a reference binder and make copies of things onto a memory stick. It's all available free of charge. Please, folks, take advantage of free resources like this. Again, it's survivalblog.com.
Yeah, a lot of people in live chat are saying thank you so much for coming on, James. And James Wesley Rawles, thank you for coming on the Edge Television broadcast. Can we have you on again sometime?
Certainly.
All right, I appreciate
you. Great evening, Daniel.
I
pray that you and your listeners all think seriously about what they need to prepare for their families. And I pray the 91st Psalm for all of you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, James.
Thank you. God bless.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody. That James Wesley Rawles, surviving the coming collapse. Well, we know something's coming, and I think it's best to prepare. Like he said, hey, it's better to prepare and not need it than need it and you haven't prepared. And I think maybe we need to prepare our souls as well. It's better. Hey, man, it's better to accept Christ and say, hey, well, he's just a ghost. It doesn't exist. Or not do it and go on the other side and say, oops, I guess he is real. Oops. I don't think that's a good place to be. All right, next week we're going to have with us Michael Heiser. And if you have been afflicted of sleep paralysis, I hear that a lot. A lot of people say that. Is that aliens? Who's doing that? Maybe it's that other guy we were talking about, the guy with the horns. I don't know. But we'll talk next week with Michael Heiser about that. 2 weeks, Bill Bean will be here providing deliverance from such said horrible things coming to you. If we haven't had a guest on the program, let me know. edgeam@yahoo.com. Thank you, everyone, for watching the Edge Television broadcast. We'll be back here next week. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to that. This program will begin to replay over and over and over in the main player until I say not, until I actually uploaded the YouTube video. So that means you get to, if you do not refresh your browser, you will get to hear the ranting points for the night, and it will just play, and you just have a good old time. You're watching the ranting points. That's the only way you're going to see them. Just kidding. All right, Daniel Ott for the Edge. Bye-bye.